As America keeps digging itself into an ideological hole while shouting from the mud pit, "Everything's fine, we got this, nothing to see here," the rest of the world watches in abject horror as the great bastion of democracy teeters more towards fascism. How do Americans tolerate this, they wonder? Because some Americans actually want it. America for the rest of the world is like watching your cousin's mental health decline, seeing them get more erratic and angry, ranting and raving, all the crazy things, looking next door at their house, knowing they're probably cooking meth over there, worried that the whole place is going to ignite and go boom, boom, which is fine in and of itself, but when it goes boom, boom, it's probably taking the whole neighborhood with them, you included, and you just kind of want to get the kids out of that environment, but you're afraid that if you even suggest that, your cousin will pull one of his many guns and do to you what he always said he'd do if anybody came into his yard. Now, look, that's always sounded sociopathic to you, but since most everyone else in your family said similar stuff, sociopathic manifesto-type rants were just normalized for you. So you just let it all go, but now you're all grown up and you went to college and learned stuff, and cousin who never left his hometown is struggling, but everybody back home just kind of thinks it's normal and okay, because to them it is normal and okay, but you're worried he's going to unalive himself, or worse, that he'll go on a spree. God Christ, that is accurate AF, as the kids say. Okay, let that sink in. Why exactly would anyone want to delve us toward fascism? Several reasons. Much of it has been covered in parts 1 through 4 of our Party Crasher series, where I've been exploring the conservative, confederate, evangelical, rural, white nationalist movement in America. It's also America's cultural fascination, obsession, and dependence on cultism. In this season of Overthinking Everything, I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism, exploring how we all fall prey to cults, willingly and blindly. How that cultism of brands and even sports teams can lead us falling for cults of ideology, personality, religion, or politics. I'm closing out the Party Crasher series, laying the foundation for the next episode, The Progress of Board Games, where we're going to discuss progressivism further, and how we the people are pawns in the much bigger governmental game. And welcome to the podcast. In just about 125 years of American history, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party had really done a number on the American people, trading positions and ideals while using we the people as political pawns in their game of influence and power brokering. The Democrats' failures through our nation's history are rivaled only by the disastrous failures of the Republican Party. By that, I mean that when left unchecked, conservative policies have a provable track record of, at most times, being disastrously catastrophic for the American economy. In those instances, it's taken liberal, if not progressive, and most times democratic socialist policies to right the ship. Liberals have saved this country as many times as conservatives have risked losing it. But the thing is, that pendulum swings. No party is completely evil. Well, both share culpability in slavery. Both share responsibility for the way this country treats her people and others. We identify by many of these labels and words, but maybe with a little storytelling mixed with your history, maybe you can see the complexity of America's parties. Defining ourselves, identifying as conservative or liberal, Democrat or Republican, or even American, lets others know which side of an issue we may be on. But based on what we know now, especially after the treasonous January 6th insurrection by conservative evangelical nationalists and fascists within the Republican Party, what does it say about us as individuals? You are the company you keep, after all. When you think about an historical purity test, whether or not something reaches the standard by which you deem worthy of your consideration or respect, then what passes that purity test now? How low does that bar get set? What are the standards? When future generations sit down to discuss this about a podcast, what will they say about us right now? Watergate was about spying on people and doing whatever it took to win. Now, that was bad. But we moved on. And apparently that bar that Republicans limboed under wasn't raised back up high enough. The Bush administration was about spying on people too, and doing whatever it took to win. January 6th was about doing whatever it takes to win. We've lowered the bar. We're always lowering the bar. Our standards. Our purity test. And it doesn't matter which side you're on, friends. This is not tinfoil hat conspiracy theory. Follow the money. Again, the biggest contributors play both sides of the field. You voted for a candidate, right? So follow the money. Because that's what it all comes down to now. Money, influence, power, favors. Look at the Trump administration's White House. No one deserved clemency more than Rod Blagojevich. Was it in his Celebrity Apprentice contract that he gets one get-out-of-jail-free card if Trump ever becomes president? And boy, wouldn't that be nice. That level of cronyism harkened back to Harding. But now how many Republicans remember that today? How many conservatives would even care today? How many Americans know history well enough to see the similarities, the patterns, or understand the ramifications? And acknowledging, for example, Gone with the Wind as a classic film study in comparison to modern films, that's one thing. But when it's clear one fondly longs for the days of Gone with the Wind, we've got some serious issues in this country. The sad fact is that a portion of our friends and neighbors would just as soon do just that. Go back to those days. That's what January 6th was about. It isn't biased to point out facts, it's biased to misrepresent facts. So I say research. Find the answers to your questions, they're out there. Check the source though. Mine are history, the U.S. Senate website, other sites with reliable and credible references. And the fact is, Republicanism only works for the very, very top of Republicans, the richest and most powerful. Everybody else just gets to rub their scratchies and hope they get a winner chicken dinner. Seriously, our economy, our paychecks, because of conservative policies and weak Democratic leadership through history, they're affected by a system you didn't agree to, with rules set to keep you from ever being able to make or change the rules. We're hamsters on a wheel. The liberals, specifically progressives, have pushed forth some of the most dynamic, changing, and effective legislation in our nation's history. And conservatives, both Republicans and Democrats, have had their fair share of wins. But over time, the impact of conservative policy on America's working class economy, long term, proves to spell doom. Still, through Watergate, through Reagan, through Bush, through Trump, and the Democratic Party still can't get it any more together than hoisting up the conservative Joe Biden. History repeats. The Republican Party has over and over again proved to be corrupt and filled with offenses, moral, ethical, and legal. Yet strategically, most of the time, they hammer down and literally do whatever it takes to win. The Democrats, when they have won, they haven't been able to hold on to it, whatever it is. And it's because the party is largely split between two sides, now, as it always has been. Today, it's statistically the younger, more progressive side, and the middle to older, more moderate side, though I don't believe age plays as much into it. So what do these words even mean? Pete Buttigieg called on a debate stage during the 2020 primaries to nominate, quote, an actual Democrat. Now, I want to explain what that means. Stepping back from labels, it's hard to consider Harry S. Truman a liberal. You could barely call him a Democrat by the standards of the time. And it's hard not to look back on Lyndon Johnson's presidency as tarnished by his brash my way or the highway rule of order and his responsibility for all the lives lost in Vietnam. Hell, while we're at it, let's just throw his racism in there too, even if he did sign the Civil Rights Act into law. We've examined America's Democratic presidents. The Democratic Party has always struggled to not only ascend to the high power, but when they get it, they fumble the ball. Sometimes, granted, not all their fault. We are dealing with the conservative win-at-any-cost politics. A political manifest destiny, if you will. The progressive movement and its diverse support constantly at battle with the conservatives within their own group. Remember, balance is what makes American politics function correctly. It's written into the Constitution. But Democrats have a history of, labels aside, shifting that power balance in America's political spectrum to the right. Ideals in a two-party system end up very black and white. For many immigrants or children of immigrants, America's stance on abortion might be morally abhorrent to their culture, faith, or religious convictions. But by standing up for that value, they must compromise their own safety and well-being in this country, as well as that of their actual children who are alive. And the threat of risking one's life to flee one oppressive government only to be hunted and reviled, fearful, under the racist thumb of another oppressive fascist government? It's foolish to assume that any one of us is that singular and one-dimensional as voters, as people. Especially with an example like this, one most white cis-presenting men in this country couldn't hardly fathom. What's happened is that we are convinced that the extremes bookend. Extremes don't bookend in politics, not American politics. On bookending extremes, you're on that 10 scale that we've talked about, and the extreme is 10 and 0 respectively, right? Except that at times when the conservatives, specifically the Republican Party, feels emboldened like right now, their arrogance swells and oozes like a cold sore, letting everyone know what you've done. Which really isn't fair, since cold sores can be caused by all sorts of things. But that's America for you. Black and white. When we end up where 10 is no longer the extreme, then what is center? I fear that as Americans, we lose sight of that. We've jumped the shark, Fonzie. Now, we're at 12 on the conservative scale. And it's hard to disagree with some of what we wake up to and are surrounded by every day. Just think of the Trump Twitter years. I mean, come on, man, not everything needs the Twitter commentary, right? What we perceive as 0 being the bookend extreme having been a consistent message for decades, making the argument to move it further out is difficult. And if 12 is the new 10, then doesn't our center change too? Right? It's at 6, right? Ideologically, we've all had to take a step, a small step, not closer to center, but closer to conservative, to cater, compromise, and cave to those traditionalist ideals, or face the violent backlash from ideological cowards too afraid to change, scared of the very core of progress. What I'm about to say will shock some, but I hope you'll let me explain. I would argue that for liberals, Democrats, whatever you want to label anything left of fascist, the extreme isn't progressivism. The extreme part of the party is and has been from the beginning the moderates. And let's not fall prey to new branding, folks. Moderate is what they started calling themselves. These are conservative Democrats, just like Woodrow Wilson, just like many. And when we consider that the progressives in this country, whether fighting for a new constitution, a country that works for the people, or to free the slaves, a new economy that works for the people, or for civil rights, a society that works for the people, or for a government that works for the people, it's had a strong influence, despite standing up to blockades of conservative obstinates within their own party as well as across the aisle. And we see how long it takes to progress due to that obstruction. It may be hard to hear, but progressives aren't the extreme of the left. The extremists to the left are the ones pulling us closer to conservative. The extreme for Democrats today is to the center. The fact is, through good old-fashioned democratic compromise, as we've seen through history, we're left with a Democratic Party that has become far removed from the principles which bred it. Which isn't so bad, but even farther removed from the principles that guided it into the modern era. Instead, as most conservatives have taken advantage of the liberals, which literally means free to give. That line moves slowly, inch by inch, further towards 12. If we're lucky. January 6th might have pushed that out farther. And how far will it go? And then when will our center be? And when we discuss radical ideals, what's more radical for a liberal? The notion that guaranteeing health care is a right with provisions in place to stop capitalism in the industry of life or well-being, or the idea that healthcare and medicine are fair game for sale to the highest bidder, and if you can't afford to live, you should have pulled yourself up by your bootstraps more. Worrying about any president or administration changing American economics from capitalism, that's ridiculous. That's why I don't entertain many socialists or communists on social media. I simply don't take them seriously because they don't take themselves seriously. I enjoy the content and the perspective, but the idea that America should abandon capitalism is noble. The idea that America would abandon capitalism is a waste of everyone's time, practically speaking. I'm interested more in discussing realistic solutions with all due respect. Capitalism will never fully be abandoned. Capitalism has its advantages, that's undeniable. Countless advancements in every imaginable field. However, the landscape of America has changed. Everything about it has changed. A lot. And capitalism only works if we as a society can agree that some things are not for sale. We're seeing capitalism fail before us because everything is for sale, even the American people. And what's being proposed by the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is what we've seen in the past. It's a new way of looking at the way we do certain things. And it comes down to money, power, and influence. And those things only serve to breed corruption. I mean, how can we really stand behind a philosophy whose primary driving force is one of the 7 deadly sins? Capitalism is fueled by greed, and only greed. But this is the pull of the modern political system in America. It serves to explain just how much "how did we get here" as anything else we've talked about. Politics and economics go hand in hand, and that's why many get them confused. We're going to clear some of that up in future episodes this season, so do not forget to subscribe. Let me break down the divide just a little bit. If you believe, let's say, that big business somehow deserves a tax incentive for building a factory in a certain place over some other place, and if you can accept the immoral amount of money that's spent trying to ensure this factory comes to your town so your people have jobs and your town will grow, but the workers make $8 an hour and many are held under the full-time threshold for benefits. What happens is that factory company says, we're looking at buying land and building. It's either going to be here, there, or over yonder. And so because you want industry and opportunity in your area, you bid. You give and you give and you give, as if your town's working class deserves $8 an hour, more than the other towns. But the other town just keeps giving and giving and giving incentives, and you have to match. But it still isn't good enough. The factory company threatens to just abandon it altogether and just build in a whole different state. Because thanks to deregulation, they also own the transport company, so they can absorb those costs and then not pass those savings on to you, the consumer, or their workers. Profit, baby! That isn't negotiation, it's bribery, among other things. It's industry and jobs being held for ransom by a broken and corrupt free market. Why do we let big business dictate the rules of their stay? We turned America over to big business in the early 20th century, and that's why capitalism is struggling today. Because we put this economic juggernaut in motion, fueled solely by greed, with no track, no guardrails. It's a matter of time before collision. The capitalism that fueled restoration and reconstruction following the Civil War, which also crashed the stock market in 1907, and the capitalism dashed with a touch of progressive and, yes, socialism inspired policy of Wilson that bounced us back after a war, and then blind Calhoun capitalism, combined with the financial autonomy of the American government having been surrendered to big banking and allowing big business to infiltrate our government, capitalism sure does get a good rap. Everyone is so defensive of capitalism, which is odd, especially since capitalism failed. The economy crashed. America had to sell itself to the private banking industry to stay afloat. Remember? Capitalism bounced us back, but it was temporary. And capitalism failed again, each time nearly taking the nation with it. Capitalism really only started working when socialism was mixed with it during the Roosevelt administration. After that, the American dream was born, and our economy, population, and expectations exploded. Nothing beats a well-regulated free market, which is all anyone is really asking for. A fair market over a free market. Americans at key intervals have been asked to decide her values. To adopt a constitution or not? Should new states be admitted as slave states? Should we go to war? Should human beings be considered humans? Our earliest values were of liberty, independence, and freedom. Okay, and white supremacy, but just go with the good stuff for a second. However, America isn't a nation in her infancy any longer, and those principles are in no way being threatened by anyone, except maybe conservative, confederate, evangelical rural voters, and hackers maybe, which is the new war front we need to be focused on, by the way. Well, I mean, that's what I'm saying. We fought hard and bloody battles on the ground, air, and sea. But the next threat is informational. And just like the rest of the world, growing and advancing, America is no longer the new kid in town. America is a nation who sprouted pubes and her voice is cracking. We are full-on hormonal adolescent, wishing to fight anyone, and we don't know why we're so bad. From the Jeffersonian to the Jackson era and into the 20th century and beyond, America will continue to grow and mature. But we need to let her. But we also must be the parents. We don't abide by the same rules we did when we were toddlers, right? Infants even. And America must adapt. Sometimes when you're grumpy, maybe your bedtime needs to change. We are at a fairness crossroads with the American working class. We've seen it before in history, similar trends. And it's because the right keeps pushing their limits and the left keeps trying to do damage control. And as the right extreme stretches the boundaries of acceptability, the left, the true left, are the ones defending the platform. Conservatism in the party pushes us all further and further to the right and tells us it's okay because we need someone who is appealing. Check that, cultism. Appealing to whom? When standing at a chasm of ideology, as the two sides of the Democratic Party are now, and the conservative and Democrats and the progressives, the message of centrism being equated with unity is frightening in and of itself. It's political gaslighting. By centering the party, you're essentially muting one of its most successful and passionate factions. Meanwhile, Democrats and liberals who cede to center are really only seeking to be more conservative. That seems pretty extreme to liberal and progressive values. Why is this tied right back to the cultisms we practice? And, well, we'll cover that coming up in this season of Overthinking Everything, as we deconstruct this culture of cultism. Regardless of where the economy is and what metrics we use to measure it at the time, just as we saw in the stock market crash and the Coolidge economy, that just because things seem to be going well doesn't mean they will end well. The path forward now, just as Roosevelt saw during the Great Depression, is that we've got to be open to new ideas and new ways of doing things, even if, and maybe especially if, those ideas failed elsewhere, or somewhere we don't like. Moreover, it's the responsibility of an advanced civilization to examine the methods, philosophies, strategies, and culture of failures as much as successes. Listen, most of our great ideas were bred out of failure. And the fact is, FDR and the progressive liberals, just like throughout history, stood up and said, these principles failed because they weren't America, and they didn't have our values. With American values and the power of our people and the Constitution, this will work. We should provide public power, programs, and services that build and create jobs, incentive to start businesses, and the government's role is to ensure these opportunities so that the society can focus on being productive and advancing us all. He didn't say that. I mean, I'm paraphrasing ideals, but you get the gist. Conservatives would have had us fending for ourselves in the workforce. But that meant long hours, inhumane working conditions, and if you didn't like it or couldn't hack it, pull on those old bootstraps a little harder. It meant child labor and an era where America's workforce went largely unprotected, broke, and hungry. The issue of how much power the federal government should have has been at the crux of our nation's divisions, every single one. And it's true today. And in a conservative versus progressive comparison, with the word liberal just sort of chucked to the wind, progressives seek new ways of fixing obviously very broken and unfair systems, laws, and institutions. Clearly, there is resistance. Traditionalists, conservatives who prefer gradual change so they can get used to it over longer periods of time. Almost like playing a board game, and two players are so immersed in strategizing against one another, they're slowing down the game for everyone else. Something we're going to touch on next in the progress of board games. Progressives are the voice stepping in saying, just go, roll the dice, do something. Progress is in no way a bad thing. In fact, without progress, the fire would still be bad. I'm not saying progress is always going to work, but prudent progress in check breeds new ideas, innovations, and advancements. And when we as a society seek to halt or stamp out progress, we have to ask exactly why. I'm hard on Truman for many reasons, and in fairness, his presidency and legacy wasn't all needlessly slaughtering hundreds of thousands of human beings in civilian-filled cities, poisoning hundreds of miles for at least 100 years with a war crime genocide. He expanded FDR's progressive policies through his 21-point program, which sought to grow Social Security and lots of workers' rights, fair housing legislation, and work towards ending poverty. Spoilers, that didn't work. The whole point is, it's okay to be critical, but there are a lot of different perspectives through which we should filter our opinion. When it comes to Truman, you could look at his presidency as the last of an era for democratic politics and American political culture. Dwight D. Eisenhower even continued those progressive policies as a Republican. Ike goes down in history as one of the top 10 best presidents we've ever had, because, in large part, of his progressive policies. When Kennedy rose, it was the dawning of a new era for the Democrats, and America, flushed into the era of pop culture, was obsessed with Hollywood. Glitz and glamour fascinated America, and as media options increased, information flow increased. But not just information like news, information on products, messages, trends, styles, ideas. Can you imagine America's social and cultural landscape without television? Oh, Kennedy looked good on TV. Most people thought. I never really saw it. He looked like a bad caricature of a toad man. Now, John, oh my God, yes. That's another podcast. The TV generation was an evolution in American politics. Newspapers informed, movies drove America's imagination, but television put a full sensory information, entertainment, and storytelling experience right in America's living room. Every day, all day. Television, especially after the Kennedy-Nixon debate, would go on to decide more presidents than even the Electoral College. In the era since television, our elections have taken on a different personality. Our candidates bigger and more exposed. We have access to more information than ever before. Yet we still rely on it to be handed to us. When we look at how the nation's political landscape has shifted almost tectonically to form these individual segments of American ideologies, it's difficult to really tell where any of us truly stand using the terms we've been handed. There are more than two parties in America. In fact, there are closer to 5 true ideologies at play, at least. It's a dangerous thing to be so closed-minded that we lack the ability to speak freely about controversial topics. Because there is a way for discourse to be handled and a way to be a hurtful schmuck like Tucker Carlson, for example. A line I like to teeter myself. And for the Democrats to be stuck in this world where we lack nuance, where everything is black and white, you lose sight of the beautiful, colorful array of possibilities. We see it in the debate stages where they speak of uniting the party under someone other than a my way or the highway candidate. This is gaslighting and conservative liberalism at its most toxic. History tells us the progressive candidate who takes charge changes America for the better. When another candidate pleads for reason that a president needs to be someone who can get things done and reach across the aisles, well, that's laughable. The same party who shut Obama down, the same party that lockstep voted against impeachment, the same party that incited and almost carried out a treasonous insurrection against America, the same party who has, as you've seen, dominated American policy for much of the last 200 years, is not one with which we, progressives or liberals, would have any luck sitting down and negotiating with. It just doesn't happen today. It hasn't for some time. And in later episodes, I'll discuss more of my journey through politics, where I realize that the O in GOP stands for obstruction, and has for most of its existence. Certainly since Newt Gingrich and the Nixon administration. The last thing we need is a candidate who will compromise more when they get things done. Because as we've seen, the right is at a 12. And the more we compromise, the more the extremist conservative Democrats will drag us to the confederacy of republicanism. This is the big switch. It isn't that the Democrats of today are the Republicans of before and the Republicans of today are the Democrats of then. None of that is confusing. The Confederate movement in this country never died. The Confederate movement in America that has been here since before this country was founded, the Confederate movement that has stewed since the Anti-Federalists lost fighting against the founding of America and its Constitution, the Confederate movement that brought us the Trail of Tears, the Confederate movement that fought so hard for states' rights to choose if they wanted to be slave states, the Confederate movement that seceded from America to form its own country where it could choose to be a slave state, the Confederate movement that pushed Jim Crowism, the Confederate movement that insisted some human beings were only 3/5 of a white human being, the Confederate movement that fought so hard against the Civil Rights Act, the Confederate movement that became the Dixiecrats, the Confederate movement that celebrated David Duke's candidacy for president, the Confederate movement that has found so many reasons to fight so hard to keep the images and institutions for their failed attempted overthrow of America. The Confederate movement that formed and grew the hate groups throughout American history, like the Ku Klux Klan, the Proud Boys, the neo-Nazis, the Oath Keepers, the police, and MAGA. Confederate conservatives. Conned throughout history, passing down uneducated and indoctrinated generational trauma, either willfully ignorant or not knowing no better. And it's all due to cultism. In Party Crashers, I've explained how these parties have manipulated and confused and sold out the American working class, and how through political indoctrination and cultism, our most foundational principles may be corrupted. When a discussion or discourse is attempted, we're just regurgitated up talking points of a deflective talking points, so they believe we're distracted from seeing who and what they are. Projection and deflection, without the critical thinking, historical context and nuance, emotional maturity, and empathy it requires to truly formulate an opinion. So when you're intellectually outmatched and backed into a corner by the moral high ground, whataboutism, what I also call yeah but. These tactics aren't arguing or debate practices. You're not engaging with someone who is coming to the interaction to learn and grow. They aren't coming into the table in good faith. They just want to prove their point. And the thing about that person is, though, they seek confirmation bias simply to exist in their bubble. They'll walk away from every discussion we have with them feeling like they've won, regardless of reality or reason. Today, just like in 1980, just like in 1944, just like in 2016, and just like in times throughout history, America is standing at a precipice of defining her personality on the world stage. Except this time, we no longer have the excuse. This time, should the nation drive farther to the right than it is now, a feat only aided by electing moderate Democrats, I fear the course of this nation for healthcare, the rights of the marginalized communities, women's health, gun control, voting, education, and the financial prosperity of the American working class will be at risk. Listen carefully to what they're saying, because they've been saying the quiet part out loud all along. Quote, in order to appeal to moderate Republicans, you have to elect a moderate Democrat. In order to appeal to conservatives, you have to elect a conservative. Quote, we can't elect a candidate who says you're either with us or you're against us. You can't elect a candidate who says they're against me and the party, who has failed the American people repeatedly. How about we nominate an actual Democrat? Historically speaking, examine your candidate under that purity test and tell me how that's worked out for Americans so far in history. And this, my friends, is the problem with the Democratic Party. Within it, you have the conservatives and the progressives. One side grasping desperately as parties' ideals are sold out over history for the sake of political relevance, and the other side trying to be more Republican. Read up a little on the 44 and 80 conventions, with the party again divided down the middle, and the Republicans more emboldened than ever. I'm afraid history may be unfolding before our very eyes in upcoming elections. What will it take to fix it? A return to common sense legislation and politics in this country. The intolerance of obstructionism for the sake of politics at the cost of we the people. Compromise, compassion, empathy. When progressivism runs rampant throughout both parties, America and her peoples win. When progressivism is pushed into the corner of the attic in hopes it never comes down for dinner, we have capitalism run amok and chaos for our American working class. Those who fight tooth and nail to stay where we're at, those who aren't quite sure yet and need a lot of convincing, those who want to go ahead and strive for Roddenberry already. Conservatives, moderates, progressives. These are the players on stage in American history. A split that's proven disastrous repeatedly in the party's history. All for the sake of power brokering, political posturing, profit, and of course, this is America, white supremacist ideals. That's it. And boy, what a ride, right? Party crashers coming to a screeching halt, and who's left to pick up the pieces? We the people, as always. That's a lot of history, a lot of missing nuance, but hopefully on this first season of Overthinking Everything, deconstructing a culture of cultism, you can see where America's parties have proven not only confusing to the American people, but at times deliberately so. How the values of white supremacy, American exceptionalism, evangelical nationalism cloaked as patriotism have infected our culture with a cancer that's eating us alive, and the gaslighting of the American people that we are a two-party system. It's just blatantly and patently false. And the gaslighting of the American workforce to vote against their best interests. This is just one small part of answering, how did we get here? A question we'll seek to answer all season long. But if you've heard the term gaslighting one too many times, there's a reason. Narcissism is at play in this equation, my friends. Coming up in the progress of board games, we'll learn more about progressivism and dispel some of the myths surrounding the ideals that have changed America. We'll learn about how America is playing Risk overseas, Monopoly at home, while the rest of us are spinning our wheels at life and praying to all the gods we don't land on have another baby. It's a game of aggravation, and nobody is saying sorry. Washington doesn't have a clue. Coming up in the progress of board games, as I deconstruct a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. Like, share, and subscribe. Do all the things I need you to do. If you like this series, if you learned something, consider a donation to Cash App. Subscribe on Patreon. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.